Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 DocLands Documentary Film Festival. I'm Ken Jacboson from the programming team, and I'm here with Director Sara Dosa to talk about her wonderful film, Fire of Love. Sara Dosa is an Indie Spirit Award-nominated director and Peabody Award-winning producer. Her producing credits include Audrey and Daisy and Survivors. She co-produced the Academy Award-nominated The Edge of Democracy and an inconvenient sequel, Truth to Power. Her first feature as a director, The Last Season, won a Golden Gate Award, as did her film, The Seer and the Unseen, which premiered in 2019. Fire of Love had its world premiere at the 2022 Sundance Film Festival, where it won the Jonathan Oppenheim Editing Award. And we're absolutely thrilled to be screening it here at DocLands. Sara Dosa, welcome to DocLands.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It means a lot to be here.
You bet. Love the film, and I'm sure our audience did too. And so my first question is the one that just pops into your head, which is, how did you come to embark on this adventure to make a film about the incredible Katia and Maurice Krafft?
I've always been fascinated by volcanoes, but it was really in the making of the last film I directed called The Seer and the Unseen that I first learned about Katia and Maurice. That film takes place in Iceland, and it's a story of an Icelandic woman who is in communication with spirits of nature. But at the beginning of the film, we wanted to kind of tell the story of how Iceland was created. And Iceland is a volcanic island, so it was created through volcanoes. So our team did some research about volcano archives, and we came across Maurice and Katia Krafft. And then the more we learned about them, the more we just fell in love with them. And we got access to the archive and just continued to fall more and more in love. We were actually about to be in pre-production on another film that was going to take place in Siberia, an observational film. And we were preparing to scout in Siberia in April 2020. But then the pandemic hit and that project collapsed, and we luckily were able to pivot to this one. So getting to make it during a time of isolation was particularly wonderful and gratifying.
So there's a lot of really great creative elements in this film, and one of them is the delightful narration by the artist, filmmaker, writer, actress, performer, multi-hyphenate Miranda July, who many people probably know best from her feature debut, Me and You and Everyone We Know. What made you think of having Miranda narrate the film?
So at first, we were thinking we wanted a French narrator just because Maurice and Katia are French, and French influences very much color the film. But in our brainstorming process, her name came up and we all just instantly said, yes, so Miranda is absolutely perfect. Part of why we were so drawn to her is because she does such an incredible job of telling kind of deeply personal, intimate stories of relationships, and but does so with such curiosity, a striking intimacy, and also a fragility that to me just is so poignant. And often in her work are these themes of kind of existentialism. And those were all things that we were really trying to play with when we were making Fire of Love. So when we began working with her, she just brought so much of her own spirit to the performance. And I can honestly say it was one of the most gratifying experiences of my whole creative life. So working with her was really a dream.
And how did you reach her, and what was her initial reaction?
So she actually had known our executive producer, Greg Boosted at Sandbox Films for some time. He reached out to her and made an introduction. She saw a rough cut of the film, and her reaction was very much like, oh yeah, I see why you want me for this. It just like made sense to her how we were writing the narration, which up until that point was done. One of our editors, Jocelyn Chaput, did the temp narration until Miranda came on board, and Jocelyn did a fantastic job. But Miranda could very much intuit kind of why she was the right person, both thematically and also just in terms of the delivery.
So let's talk about love and death. Obviously, two big themes of the movie. And let's take love first. Obviously love stories have been a part of film since the beginning. Love stories are a significant genre. How did you approach this particular love story in such a way as to be able to tell it in a fresh way, which I think you do?
Oh, thank you. I was first and foremost inspired by Katia and Maurice themselves. One of the first things I ever read when we began researching for this film was a sentence in one of Maurice's books where he wrote, "For me, Katia and volcanoes, it is a love story." That now comes at the very end of the film, but it just instantly in my head was like, okay, Katia, Maurice, volcanoes, they form a love triangle. And to me, I thought that was just really fun and playful, and also so true to them. Volcanoes are not just subjects of scientific curiosity. They truly were their loves and their passions. So the idea to create a film that placed this love triangle at its heart was really kind of rich narrative territory for us to explore. It was really challenging though, since Maurice and Katia, in their archives, there's no imagery of them holding hands or kissing, or some of these kind of conventional images that one thinks of when you think about telling a love story. But we quickly realized that their love was perhaps too expansive for that kind of imagery. Instead, volcanoes were their love language, so to speak. And when we looked at the imagery that they shot, it's just, you can just feel just how drawn in they are by volcanoes. There's some shots of like Katia delicately like petting the obsidian rock face, or Maurice charging forward on a lava flow, trying to get to, the heat as fast as possible. So the imagery that they shot themselves illustrated their love better than any kind of imagery of them, say, kissing or holding hands ever could. And so that's kind of what we leaned into as we were kind of developing the aesthetic and trying to tell this story, all the while kind of minding just some of the kind of classic romantic tropes of a doomed love story, knowing that they were going to die all along, but end up dying in a way where they became one with their beloved volcano in the end.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned love triangle, and in my notes for I noted that I referred to it also as a love triangle with the three of them, based on that quote in part from Maurice. And, as a triangle, those three elements kind of need to be in balance to work. What were some of the specific challenges of keeping them all in balance? Maurice, Katia, the volcanoes.
For us, when we were researching and writing kind of our outlines and editing together the story, we were actually really moved by how out of balance they were, or actually the moment where they would approach balance, all of a sudden something could offset that balance. For example, Maurice and Katia, once they kind of gained their footing as volcanologists, they began to hit their stride, they were able to fund their expeditions and start traveling around the world. They realize that volcanoes aren't quite what they seem, so to speak. That kind of comes through in the scene from Nyiragongo in 1977, where they hypothetically know that volcanoes, of course, are these destroyers, but they hadn't witnessed destruction and death themselves yet. They do so, in that moment in Nyiragongo, 1977. But they're forced to reckon kind of with really the disastrous, destructive side of their kind of beloved volcano, which up until that point, they thought was a bit more friendly, to borrow a word from Maurice. So they kind of, there's various moments where they do swing out of balance, where they get a little too close, but they're always kind of pulled back in by their love. And Maurice and Katia themselves too have different ways of romancing volcanoes, so to speak, and this places some tension in between the two, but they realize that they need each other if they're going to go about pursuing this dangerous work, which for them is their highest calling. So we're hoping that those kinds of swings out of balance could create some of that dramatic tension, which was very much felt throughout their life. But in the end, I think they're reconciled, sadly in death, but maybe that's really where they're most complete.
I don't think we ever see them actually fight or quarrel. Did you ever run into any any situation? Well, no, there was the one where he did his crazy trip on the lake of sulfuric acid, and
Yeah.
she was furious. That
Yep.
might be the only time. Were there others?
We certainly heard stories about fighting, but none of them appear on film. In one of the books about them, there's some like kind of verbatim transcripts and whatnot. But yeah, certainly they, as Maurice says at the very beginning of the film, they were volcanic. They erupt often, in his words. So, from all of the research that we did, and aside from reading a ton of books, including their own, we interviewed a number of people who they worked with, family members, loved ones, and such. And they would always say, like, yes, they had disagreements, but there is always an unmistakable love there, and they could always reconcile in the end. And so they never sounded like they were like very, incredibly like heated, dangerous types of arguments. But given kind of the high stakes of the work that they did have strong personalities and stuck to their proverbial guns, but always found a way to make it work.
Speaking of interviews with others, the film is striking because really we pretty much just hear from the two of them, either in archival or through their writings. We don't have any experts talking about them or other people who knew them. Was that an approach you knew from the beginning you were going to take, or did you come to it over the course of the film?
Yeah, that was an approach that we wanted to stick to from the beginning. We thought that it would be particularly interesting to tell their story through the materiality of what they left behind, first and foremost. There were times though where we questioned this, and I'm happy that we did, because we wanted to further explore, like, could we add more emotional depth if we added this voice here or that voice there? But we ultimately realized by having it more tightly focused around them, that could help to flesh out the relationship a bit more and have a kind of more of a deeper connection to the story. But the interviews that we did really helped to write the narration. The narration is very much culled from so many other people's experiences, and helped us to create a more accurate portrait of them than just their public record.
So, death. You make no secret in the film that they died pretty early on in the first few minutes. You indicate, that they died. But, that presents a narrative challenge for you. So what was it like for you in terms of writing, in terms of constructing the film, to kind of lay the track for the moment when they're finally going to meet their fate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much of this film is about time, the extent of a human life, the longevity of a volcano. So we early on, we were really thinking about how we could like set the proverbial clock for our own film, to build a sense of dramatic tension through that, but also to kind of pull into focus right away that Maurice and Katia were very much rationing their hours, just the same way they rationed their film. And so we thought by putting that early on, that could really help set that framework, and also establish the kind of the cinematic grammar that we're telling a film through what they left behind. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge that they've passed away, and this is what remains of their legacy. So that was something, early on we wrote that in, and we were a little worried about, if it gave away something so dramatic so soon, but we found that it ended up heightening, at least in our opinion. So we felt like it heightened the drama, rather than, gave it all away too early on.
In the end, how did you want the audience to, and it doesn't need to be in one particular way, but how did you want the audience to experience and process their death?
I think in my heart of hearts, I would love for the audience to I think realize that they died a meaningful death because they lived a meaningful life. And there's of course sadness in all loss. And it's my highest hope that the audience came to know and love Maurice and Katia through the course of the film. So we'll be met with sadness for knowing of their passing. But I hope too that there's the realization that they died exactly how they wanted. They knew that this was going to happen. It's not actually included in the film, but just before they died, Maurice actually said on camera the very day that they passed away, he said that if I die tomorrow, I'll be happy because I've seen so many beautiful things. So they knew what they were doing. And I think that there's a lot to celebrate in that kind of boldness and that kind of reconciliation with living life in a way that allows you to meet death openly. So yeah, I hope that's how audiences will understand their death. I should also say in a beautiful biography about them, their dear friend André Desmaisons writes about how when they died, they became one with the volcano. And that's not language we use in the film, but it's something that guided our process. And I really feel like that's for me, they became one with the volcano finally and can rest eternally, with their love. So I hope the audience will feel that as well.
Another thing about them, of course, is they're French. They're from Alsace and almost the same very spot. And, I think their Frenchness really comes through in the film, and it's one of the sort of delightful aspects of it, honestly. They're not American. They're very, very much not American. But how important was their Frenchness, to coin a phrase, to you when you were, putting this together, both in terms of who they were as scientists and public figures?
So yeah, they're so beloved in France and throughout the world, but in France they're very much seen as local as celebrities, and that's part of why there's a lot of archives of them. But it was very important to us that the film felt authentic to their cultural reality, to the kind of the worldview in which they were raised, and also to the country where they were born. We were also really inspired by the kind of cultural aesthetics happening at the time when they were themselves coming of age. For example, French New Wave cinema played a huge role in how we put together the film. It's very much in Maurice and Katia's own work. For example, in a lot of Maurice's cinematography, you can see those like really fun like snap zooms and pans that remind me of a lot of French New Wave films, and the way they write their books actually felt like the way Truffaut does a lot of his narration in his films. So there's that aesthetic influence was very present in their own work and served as a guide for us when we were going about our editing process. So we really wanted to bring that in as much as possible, hopefully not in a cliche way, but just one that felt kind of just true to them and who they were and what they were interested in. Even though we're American, we wanted to try to ground it as much as we could in that kind of context.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated the kind of the references to the French New Wave. They really works very nicely with the film. Talk a bit more about the archival, working both with their so-called deep archive and the archival material that you and your team pulled together.
Sure. So the Kraffts archive was housed at an archival facility in Nancy, France, by an archival house called Image Est. And the curators there are just incredible. They were wonderful partners for us to have on board and worked with us to scan just the hundreds of hours that we used in the film. The footage we received, it was 16 millimeter, and it did not have sync sound, which was very challenging for us because we didn't have sound as our guide. So my fabulous editors, Aaron Casper and Jocelyn Chaput, actually created soundscapes for the 16 millimeter footage. And then we ended up working with a sound team in Montreal. But that was very challenging. the imagery itself in the 16 millimeter footage, of course, was spectacular, but it also had some limitations. For example, certain shots would be like 5 seconds long, 2 seconds long, or, at most like 12 seconds long, but it was very difficult to kind of work with because of that. But those limitations really did help us kind of develop the style of the film, because it allowed us, we basically had to be very associative with those kinds of limitations and juxtapose things. It allowed for us to kind of bring in the narrator where we needed, or, we have those moments in the film where we like press pause on the image, and that's because we run out of the shot, but we want to hold it somehow. So we tried to figure out ways to embrace the limitations of the archive, that could then, give birth to an aesthetic that worked with the film. So then the other kind of batch of footage that we had, they were largely talk shows or TV programs that were filmed with Maurice and Katia from the late 60s all the way through, I believe the last one was in 1991, just before they died. And we were so lucky to get a hold of these. We were working with an archival researcher named Nancy Marcotte, who tracked all those down. And we were so excited to have their own words and images, and seeing them, banter in person on screen, since that didn't show up at all in their own archives. So we were trying to find the right balance of using those moments to flesh out their characters, and then bring in their own archives to really show where they were and what they were doing, and particularly their own gaze, what they were really drawn to. So it was very much a balance between weaving those two kind of buckets of archives together.
So the images are incredibly striking, but the sound design is also really impressive, and I loved some of those Foley effects, and just the overall tone that the sound design sets, which is generally, I think, a playful tone, or at least in many scenes it is. How did you and your team kind of come up with the general scope of the sound design?
Sound design, it was really fun working on the sound design for this film. We wanted the sounds to feel, of course, true to the landscapes and to the people themselves. But we were really thinking about the character of the volcano, first and foremost, when constructing the sound design. And we wanted the volcano to feel as alive and sentient as possible. And as absolutely powerful. So we really thought about what are sounds that can bring out almost a kind of a monstrosity to the volcano. Erin, at one point when she was working with the sound on the scene in Indonesia, where they go to the Krakatau volcano, experimented with putting dinosaur sounds in with explosions in a very subtle way. Like you wouldn't ever know that it was dinosaur sounds unless you talk to Erin about it. But I loved that so much, to try to bring out this, this grandiose sense of a supernatural being almost. We were really guided by magic realism as well. And sound luckily allows you to really play in kind of tropes of magic. So that was really fun for us too. One of the challenges though was trying to stay as close to Maurice and Katia as possible. So we did work hard to, have little things like footsteps or the rustling of their shirt, adjusting the camera, things like that to really bring focus and attention deeply to them. So you could just, to make sure the audience's eyes land on them, even though there's, these majestic things happening in the background.
For my last question here, I do want to bring it back to Maurice and Katia and ask you, what do you admire most about this incredible couple?
Oh, wow. Well, I could spend so much time talking about that, but I'll try and keep it short. I think I admire most how they knew what was deeply meaningful to them, to each of them and to each other. And they went for it. They pursued kind of this deep love and this deep sense of wanting to understand volcanoes and also humanity. but even knowing that they could never fully understand, but they still went for it. And I do think that that pursuit of love and that pursuit of knowledge is what allowed them to live a meaningful life and ultimately die a meaningful death. And that's something that I personally am so inspired by, and I've really thought a lot about, especially during the pandemic and a time of such uncertainty of what it means to pursue the thing that you love most in the world, despite all risks and dangers and charges of being crazy. So that's one thing I'm really taking away from them and their story.
Well, thank you so much. And it's clear that you yourself have a pursuit of making really beautiful, meaningful films. And so congratulations on Fire of Love. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for tuning in.
Oh, thank you so much for the fun conversation, Ken. And so I'm so honored again to have our film screen at DocLands.
Absolutely. Take care. Thanks, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.